On a freezing winter day, a compassionate waitress gave two hungry orphans a bowl of soup and lost her job because of it. 2 decades later, Eliza Penrose's calm routine is disrupted when a polished luxury McLaren pulls up outside her cafe. Stepping out are Daniel and Ana Serrano, the same children she once helped, now grown into adults with influence, success, and a gratitude she never imagined. What they disclose will restore her reputation, uncover the falsehoods that destroyed her, and prove that a single act of kindness can change everything. Eliza hadn't had a visitor in 10 years when that Christmas Eve rolled around in 2023. Not since the town called her a thief, not since the church called her worse. The whispers followed her like shadows in those days. And I watched from this very window as neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past her little house on Maple Street. But on that particular Christmas Eve night, when that black McLaren purred up her broken driveway like a cat stalking prey, some debts don't stay buried forever. The two figures stepping out of that gleaming car carried the kind of reckoning that only comes when the hungry get fed and the liars get found. The headlights cut through the December darkness, illuminating her old soup kitchen sign, hanging crooked on its rusty chain. Humble bowl. It had read once back when the letters were faded and the hope wasn't gone. The paint was peeling now, 20 years of weather having taken its toll. But somehow those words still held power, still meant something to folks who remembered. A man stepped out first, his movements careful and deliberate. Even from my window 3 houses down, I could see he was tall, well-dressed, the kind of man who'd learned to carry himself with purpose. His gloved hand clutched something small and stained. My old eyes weren't what they used to be, but I could tell it was a napkin, old and yellowed with age. A napkin from 2003, as it would turn out. But why did they wait 20 years to come back, and why? Vivian Blackwell's name was scribbled on that napkin in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. Well, that's where our story truly begins. The woman who emerged from the passenger side moved with the grace of someone who'd fought battles and won them. Someone who'd learned that victory sometimes tastes like soup and sometimes like justice. Her hair caught the streetlight, and for a moment, I thought I was seeing a ghost. But ghosts don't drive McLarens, and ghosts don't carry briefcases full of legal documents that would topple an empire built on the suffering of children. You see, December 17, 2003, was the day Eliza Penrose lost her job and found her soul. I remember it clear as yesterday, because that was the morning my Lillian Keats made her last batch of Christmas cookies, before the cancer took her voice away. The snow was falling thick that morning, the kind that makes the whole world look clean, even when it's rotten underneath. From my kitchen window, I watched the flakes dance in the amber glow of the streetlights. Each one perfect and unique, just like the souls we meet in this life. Eliza had been working the morning shift at Hopper's Diner over on Commerce Street, pouring coffee for truckers and serving up eggs that had seen better days. It was honest work for honest pay, and Eliza had never asked for more than that. She was the kind of woman who said please and thank you to everyone, who remembered how customers liked their coffee, who slipped extra bacon to the construction workers who reminded her of her daddy. Hopper's wasn't much to look at. Truth be told, the linoleum was cracked. The booths were held together with duct tape and prayer. And the coffee machine made sounds like a dying cat when it was brewing. But it was warm, and it smelled like home cooking. And for folks who didn't have much of either, it was a sanctuary. Eliza understood that. She'd made it her mission to make sure everyone who walked through those doors felt like they belonged somewhere, even if it was just for the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. But then they walked in, and everything changed. Daniel Serrano and Ana Serrano, 7 and 9 years old, respectively, though their eyes looked decades older. They weren't beggars, mind you. Ghosts is what they were, with ribs like prison bars showing through. Their thin jackets and fingers were so pale they looked translucent. Their shoes had holes that let the snow seep through. and Ana Serrano kept stomping her feet to keep the feeling in her toes, making little squeaking sounds on the worn linoleum. They stood by the door like they weren't sure they were allowed to come in, their eyes taking in the warmth and the smell of food with the kind of hunger that goes deeper than the stomach. Daniel had his arm around his sister's shoulders, protective in the way that children learn to be when adults fail them. Ana clutched a paper bag that looked like it held everything she owned in this world. When Eliza saw them huddled by the door, something stirred in her chest, something she hadn't felt since she was their age, standing in the kitchen of Sister Bernadette's orphanage, watching the other children fight over scraps. She remembered the taste of watered-down gruel and the ache of going to bed with an empty stomach. She remembered Sister Bernadette's ruler across her knuckles when she was caught stealing bread for the smaller children. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Sister Bernadette had been a woman who believed suffering built character, that hunger taught gratitude, that children were born sinful and needed to be purged of their wickedness through deprivation. Stealing bread gets you the closet, the old nun would say, her voice sharp as winter wind, her eyes cold as January frost. But sharing it gets you the strap. Eliza could still feel the welts that strap had left, could still remember the taste of her own blood when she bit her tongue to keep from crying out. But what Sister Bernadette never understood was that every blow of that strap only strengthened Eliza's resolve to be different, to be better, to be the kind of person who saw hunger and filled it instead of using it as a weapon. Looking at these two children, Eliza saw herself 30 years back, all hollow cheeks and desperate hope. Without a word, she moved to the soup pot and ladled out the biggest bowl the diner had, thick with vegetables and links of beef that cost more than her hourly wage. The soup was her own recipe, something she'd been perfecting for months, adding herbs and spices she bought with her own money to make it taste like love felt warm. She slid the bowl across the counter along with a basket of crackers and 2 glasses of milk that she'd pay for herself if she had to. The milk was fresh and cold, the kind of white that promised nutrition and comfort. She added a pat of butter to the crackers, knowing that sometimes it's the small luxuries that remind us we're human. Ana's eyes went wide as saucers when she saw that feast spread before them. She grabbed a handful of crackers and stuffed them in her sock with the quick, furtive movements of someone who'd learned that food was never guaranteed. For later, she whispered, as if speaking too loud might make the bounty disappear like a mirage in the desert. Daniel Serrano said nothing, just stared at that bowl like it was the Holy Grail itself. His hands shook as he picked up the spoon, and Eliza could see the prayer of gratitude in his eyes, the kind of thanksgiving that comes from the very depths of the soul. When he took that first sip, his whole body relaxed for maybe the first time in months. Walt McKenna, the dishwasher who'd been working at Hopper's since before televisions were in color, shuffled over and watched the children eat. He was a man of few words, carved from granite and weathered by time. But when he did speak, folks listened. His hands were scarred from years of washing dishes in scalding water, and his back was bent from decades of standing over industrial sinks, but his eyes were sharp and kind.
"Kid," he said to Eliza, his voice rough as sandpaper dragged across concrete, "you just fed 2 wolves. The problem is one's named Vivian. Now, Vivian Blackwell was the kind of woman who wore her cruelty like jewelry, all shiny and displayed for the world to see. She managed the day shift at Hopper's with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. And she had eyes like a hawk and twice the mean streak. She'd been watching Eliza and those children from across the diner, her red lipstick pursed in disapproval, that could freeze coffee in the cup. Vivian believed in rules the way some people believe in religion, with zealous fervor and no room for interpretation. There was a rule about not serving people who couldn't pay, a rule about portion control, a rule about everything that might interfere with the profit margin. She kept those rules written down in a little notebook she carried, adding new ones whenever she caught someone showing too much humanity. Her office was in the back of the diner, a cramped space that smelled of cigarettes and cheap perfume. The walls were covered with employee schedules, health department certificates, and photographs of Vivian with various local dignitaries. She kept a calculator on her desk at all times, constantly running numbers, always looking for ways to squeeze more profit from less investment. But Eliza had learned something important in those orphanage years, something that Vivian would never understand. Kindness ain't free. It's a debt the world collects with interest, and the interest rate varies depending on how much love you put into the principal. And sure enough, as those children finished their soup and wiped their hands on the empty bowl, Vivian's scream cut through the diner like a knife through silk. "Where's the cash?" The tip jar was gone. $2,347 that Eliza had been saving for her mother's Christmas present had vanished like smoke in the wind. It wasn't much money, not to most folks, but to Eliza it represented hours of refilled coffee cups and patient smiles, small kindnesses that added up to something meaningful. Vivian's painted nails left moon-shaped cuts on Eliza's arm as she grabbed her. Her French manicure drew blood from skin that had already been weathered by years of honest work. "I saw you with those little thieves," Vivian hissed. Her breath smelled of coffee in spite and something rotten underneath. "You're all in it together, aren't you? Running some kind of scam on my diner." The accusation hit Eliza like a physical blow. In all her years of working, in all her years of serving others, no one had ever questioned her honesty. Her integrity was the one thing she'd managed to keep intact through all the hardships of her life. The one treasure that couldn't be stolen or lost or broken. The police came within the hour, their boots heavy on the cracked linoleum, their questions sharp and suspicious. Officer Ramirez was kind enough, but Officer Harden had the look of a man who'd already made up his mind before he walked through the door. They took statements from Vivian, from Walt McKenna, from the 3 customers who'd been in the diner when the jar disappeared. The children were long gone by then, vanished into the December cold like they'd never existed at all. But the empty bowl remained on the counter, a testament to the meal that had started this whole chain of events. Eliza stared at that bowl while the officers questioned her, wondering if she'd somehow brought this on herself by daring to show compassion. The manager came next, Mr. Ellison, a thin man who looked like he'd been pressed flat by the weight of corporate expectations. He'd been running Hoppers for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never had an employee accused of theft. His hands shook as he filled out the paperwork, as if the very act of firing someone might contaminate him with their supposed dishonesty. By evening, there was a pink slip in Eliza's locker and a notice that read "Terminated for theft" in Vivian's careful handwriting. But the real crime wasn't the missing money, though that stung deep enough. The real crime was that napkin, the one Eliza had used to wipe Ana's chin when the child had dripped soup on her jacket. Later, much later, Eliza would remember the details that didn't make sense at the time. The way Vivian had lingered by the children's table after they'd left. The way she'd picked up that napkin and examined it closely before stuffing it in her apron pocket. The way she'd smiled when she thought no one was looking. A smile born not of joy, but of pure satisfaction. The napkin carried Vivian's lipstick print. Of course it did, but it held something more numerals scratched in what looked like Daniel's unsteady, childlike script. Digits that, when placed in proper order, became the combination to the diner's safe numbers no patron should ever know. Numbers Vivian herself had scribbled and left carelessly on the counter that morning while hurrying to make the bank deposit. Hopper's security cameras were ancient and fickle. And wouldn't you know it, the footage from 3:07 p.m. was mysteriously corrupted. Technical malfunction, the company told police when they asked to review the tape. Happens all the time with old systems. Walt McKenna knew better though. As Eliza emptied her locker that night, hands trembling with equal parts fury and heartache, he hobbled over with his familiar limp and whispered words that would echo in her head for years. "Rayleigh's brother runs the shelter those kids vanished from," he murmured, eyes flicking toward the kitchen where Vivian was tallying the day's take with unusual thoroughness. Funny how kids keep disappearing there, and Riley keeps getting bonuses for efficiency. Pieces of a wider puzzle lay scattered around them, but Eliza was too raw and blindsided to fit them together. Yet all she could feel was the sheer unfairness of it. How 2 decades of honest work could be wiped away by one moment of compassion gone wrong. That night, trudging home through snow that had shifted from pretty to perilous, she caught a final glimpse of Daniel Serrano and Ana as they were lifted into a Child Protective Services van, their small bodies dwarfed by the official-looking adults around them. Ana wept, her tears freezing on her cheeks in the bitter air. But Daniel didn't cry. He stared straight at Eliza through the back window, his young face set with a resolve far older than his 7 years. His lips shaped 2 words she would never forget. 2 words that would ring in her mind for the next 20 years: will return. The van vanished into the dark, taking them back to whatever hell they'd fled, and Eliza stood in the falling snow, wondering whether she had just witnessed her own undoing or theirs. Morning brought a blow that turned her blood to ice and broke her heart all over again. Humble Bowl, the tiny soup kitchen she had been planning to open with her life savings, was condemned by the city. The building she'd put a deposit on, the place she meant to serve anyone in need, was suddenly deemed structurally unsound, according to an inspector's report that seemed to appear overnight like mushrooms after rain. The report was signed by Inspector Trent Mallory, who just happened to be married to Vivian's cousin. The condemnation order bore a co-signature from Deputy Mayor Sterling Pratt, who just happened to be Vivian's new boyfriend and soon to be her husband at a wedding society pages would call the season's crown jewel. Funny how love and politics make convenient companions, how money and power swirl together like cream into coffee. Eliza's deposit, every cent she'd saved through 5 years of double shifts and skipped meals, was forfeit under the lease's fine print. No refunds for acts of God or municipal actions. Standing before that condemned shell on the morning of December 19, 2003, Eliza felt something inside her chest go quiet. Not her kindness, not her drive to help, but her faith in the system meant to protect people like her, the ones supposedly built to reward hard work and punish those who prey on the vulnerable. The wrecking ball arrived that same afternoon, as if the city couldn't wait to scrub away every trace of her dream.
She stood with the onlookers, watching 2 decades of planning crumble to dust and broken brick. The clamor of destruction was deafening. Yet, she could still hear the memory of her own voice, explaining to the bank officer how she would serve free meals to anyone who came through those doors. When the dust finally settled and the loaders started carting off wreckage, Eliza spotted 2 faces she knew in the crowd. They didn't weep like the neighbors who understood what she'd hoped to build. They weren't mournful or kind. They were tracking distance, how far they'd been shoved back with every crashing slab, every buckling beam. Only later would she realize that Daniel Serrano and Ana were pocketing every detail of that destruction, shelving it beside each wrong they'd witnessed, every cruelty survived. Even at 7 and 9, they were assembling a record, gathering proof for a judgment they wouldn't bring for 20 years. With no job, no prospects, and no references, no future in a town that had decided she was a thief, Eliza's dream of a soup kitchen folded into something smaller and more immediate. A grocery lot card on loan, a second-hand hot plate, a wobbly card table sturdy enough to carry hope. She rolled it beneath the Morrison Street Bridge, where homeless veterans clustered and the city's forgotten found shelter from weather and respectable stares. Concrete, there was palimpsest graffiti layered with love and loss, deferred plans and broken vows. But beauty lived there. 2 murals by artists who knew real art often climbs from the darkest ground. The veterans became her sentries, women and men, who'd seen too much battle and not enough peace. People who understood what it meant to be tossed aside by a country that once called them heroes. C. Miguel Sandoval had left a leg in desert, storm, and lost his family to the long way home. Maeve Callahan pulled 3 tours in Vietnam as an army nurse and came back to a nation that spat on her scrubs. "You fed my boy," Javier Rios told her one bitter January night, eyes soft behind the scars that traced half his face. Leo Castillo had been one of the kids she slipped extra pancakes to on Sundays. "Now we feed you." They formed a living ring around her makeshift galley broken. Soldiers who'd learned the hardest fights aren't waged with weapons, but with mercy. They hauled water, shared cans from their meager stores, and stood guard while she cooked, making sure no one hassled the woman who fed others. When she could barely feed herself, in the dented recipe tin she carried wrapped in plastic against the rain, Eliza kept more than directions for soup. Every napkin scrawled with thanks. Every scrap where someone wrote a name to prove they existed. Each small token from someone she'd fed. The box became a ledger of dignity, proof that kindness given returns as kindness. There were letters from truckers who remembered her coffee, from students who scraped up change during finals, from single mothers who brought their kids to Hoppers because it was the only night out they could afford. Every slip told a story, and each story mattered. At the bottom, wrapped like a relic, lay a photograph she'd chased down as it skittered in the wind after the wrecking ball struck. Someone dropped it or flung it, sure no one would care. Eliza cared. What she saw ran ice through her veins. The image caught Vivian handing a thick envelope to Harold Whitcomb, the CPS director, both smiling like they'd just sealed a profitable bargain. They stood outside Cedar Ridge Group Home, the place the records claimed had housed Daniel and Ana before they wandered into Hoppers that December morning. The timestamp read December 20th, 2003, one day after Daniel and Ana were pulled back into the system. One day after Elisa lost everything. One day after Vivian Blackwell got exactly what she wanted. For 10 long years, Eliza ladled soup from that cot under the bridge. She served day laborers between jobs, college kids whose aid had evaporated, young adults who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to land. She fed retired teachers whose pensions had been gutted, disabled veterans waiting on benefits that might never arrive, immigrant families whose American dream had collided with hard math. Each bowl carried a story, and each story settled into Eliza's bones like silt in a river. She came to see she wasn't just filling stomachs. She was feeding souls, tending the part of humanity society had ignored or abandoned. But on nights when the bridge fell, still traffic murmuring overhead and wind whistling through steel doubts seeped in. Was she saving souls or drowning her shame in an ocean of hunger no one person could ever fill? It was worst when officers told them to move along, when inspectors seized her cot for code violations, when well-meaning neighbors complained about the eyesore of desperation in their tidy district. Some nights on her shelter bunk, she wondered if Vivian had been right, if she was enabling people who should be helping themselves. Then morning came, and someone approached with hollow eyes and empty hands. And Eliza remembered why she began. Soup isn't only food, she'd learned. It's proof. Proof someone saw you when the world looked away. Proof you mattered when everything else said you didn't. Proof love can be measured by the tablespoon and served hot when the rest of life is gone. Cold. Years slipped by like seasons, new faces, familiar hungers. Eliza's hair silvered, then went white. Her hands ached from stirring and pouring. Her back bent from lugging water and folding tables. Her feet flattened from hours on concrete, but her smile held, her ladle stayed moving, and her faith in simple goodness somehow outlived every cruelty the world hurled at her. Then came the fire that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in March 2013, nearly 10 years to the day since she'd been fired from Hoppers. Eliza had just finished serving about 40 people when Tommy Rourke, a veteran, haunted by addiction and demons with names, but no cures, drifted near the propane tank with a lit cigarette loose on his lips. The blast wasn't enormous, but it was swift and ravenous. Flames sprinted through her setup like a living thing, devouring months of careful order in minutes. The cot, the hot plate, the wobbling table that had become her altar of service, gone to ash and twisted metal by the time firefighters made it through.
The sharpest loss was the recipe box and its fragile treasury of dignity. 20 years of thank yous and napkin notes. 2 decades proving her work mattered. A lifetime of evidence that kindness loops back in kind, lifted away as smoke carried her life's work into the gray March sky. Tommy was badly burned, second-degree injuries across his arms and face. As the ambulance doors closed, he kept apologizing through blistered lips. "I'm sorry, Miss Eliza. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it." Even then, while everything she'd built turned to cinders, Eliza clasped his hand and said, "It's all right, sweetheart. Things can be replaced." "You can't." The fire investigator, a compassionate woman named Captain Erin O'Malley, found Eliza perched on a broken slab, staring at what was left with dry eyes and a heavy chest. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it. She'd seen enough blazes to know the difference between losing belongings and losing purpose, but not everything burned. In the deepest corner of that metal box shielded by plastic and Eliza's foresight, one item survived. A business card. Edges singed, print still readable. Blackwell Holdings, creating solutions for tomorrow's challenges. Cream stock, expensive, the kind that whispers power. On the back, in a hand Eliza didn't recognize, were the faded words, "Cedar Ridge, monthly payments. Keep quiet." The note sent her pulse racing with the first clean hope in years. Cedar Ridge, the group home where Daniel and Ana had vanished 2 decades earlier. Monthly payments that could only mean one thing. Someone was being paid to keep silent about what happened there. And the card belonged to Vivian Blackwell's company, the empire built on the ashes of other people's dreams. That card became Eliza's compass, her reason to rise each morning and figure out how to rebuild what the fire stole. She spent long nights at the public library, scrolling through records until her eyes burned. Miss Park, the librarian and elder who remembered when libraries were sanctuaries, brought coffee and gentle reminders to rest. "You're hunting for something specific," she observed one evening as Eliza rubbed her temples. "It wasn't a question. Justice," Eliza answered. "I'm looking for justice." What she found in the numbers made her stomach turn in a way hunger never had. Blackwell Holdings' tax returns for the past decade told a story both intricate and brutally simple. Buried in schedules and agendas, hidden behind corporate jargon and accounting fog, lay proof of a system designed to profit from human misery. Dining Solutions, $12,000 per month from Cedar Ridge Group Home. Read line 47 of the 2012 return. The same amount appeared annually, always from the same source, always labeled consulting fees for nutritional program management. Cedar Ridge, the place where Daniel and Ana's paperwork had gone missing. The facility had a suspicious number of runaways who were never reported missing. It was an institution receiving state funds to house and feed children who, on paper, didn't exist. The deeper she dug, the uglier it became. Cedar Ridge, a temporary placement center, kept kids an average of over 3 years. The state paid $400 per child per day for housing, school, medical care, and food. But the children weren't being educated. They were working in industrial kitchens, preparing meals for other state facilities. They weren't getting real medical care. A nurse practitioner with a history of falsified records handled them. And they certainly weren't being fed properly. Nutrition budgets were siphoned off for consulting, which seemed to have meant teaching hungry kids to prepare food they couldn't eat. The paper trail ran through shell companies and dummies. And at the center sat Vivian Blackwell, her empire shielded by officials too corrupted to care or too clueless to notice. Here's where the tale turns in ways no one, least of all me, expected. Daniel and Ana hadn't just survived the hell Vivian and her brother engineered. They rose in ways that would make even the most hopeful caseworker cry. Daniel built a company called Nourish from little more than a phone app, and the resolve to make sure no child went hungry as he had. By 2020, Nourish delivered free meals into food deserts, partnering with restaurants to redirect surplus to families in need. The company outgrew Blackwell Holdings' wildest dreams, and every dollar of profit fed new programs. Aina fought in courtrooms instead of kitchens. She took the cases no one wanted, children failed by the system, families crushed by bureaucracy, voices smothered by power. Her firm, Penrose and Associates, was named after a diner worker who showed her grace when the world showed only contempt. She earned a reputation for winning the unwinnable through grit and an intimate understanding of institutional failure. For 20 years, they watched Vivian gathering evidence like spiders spinning a web. Every contract, every falsified report, every child who vanished into her machinery and emerged broken was documented, cataloged, and readied for the day justice would knock. They'd learned that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice perfected, aged until potent enough to topple empires built on suffering. They learned to think in decades, plotting moves like chess players 20 turns ahead. The McLaren that rolled up to Eliza's house that Christmas Eve wasn't originally theirs. It had belonged to Vivian Blackwell, with funds meant to feed hungry children, driven to charity galas where she accepted awards for helping at-risk youth. Now the signed title sat in the glove box along with the deed to a downtown building worth more than all the soup kitchens in the world. But money wasn't why they came. Money was just a tool, a means to an end 20 years in the making. They came to deliver something rarer: vindication, justice, and the quiet sweetness of watching Vivian Blackwell finally face consequences for 2 decades of cruelty dressed up as charity. Aina stepped from the McLaren, looking every bit the leader she'd become, steady and self-possessed. But when she saw Eliza through the window, her poise cracked just a little. For a heartbeat, she was 9 again, clutching a paper bag that held her whole life, wordlessly grateful for a bowl of soup and the kindness of a stranger who chose to see her humanity when others saw a problem to manage. Daniel moved like a man careful with power, someone who knew real strength comes from service, not control. In his hand was the napkin that had sealed it all 20 years before. Sealed in plastic, it was evidence that was always ready to speak for itself. When the story broke in January 2024, the press dubbed it the Soup Kitchen Scandal. Those who had watched knew it was far more a reckoning 2 decades in the making. Proof that the arc of the moral universe may bend toward justice, but sometimes needs a firm hand to help it along. Vivian Blackwell stood on the courthouse steps in a designer suit and pearls, declaring innocence to every camera and mic. She spoke of disgruntled ex-employees and ungrateful charity cases, of a conspiracy by people who didn't grasp the complexities of social services. Her lawyer, a very expensive man in a very expensive suit, invoked the presumption of innocence and the perils of trial by media. But words are air until evidence gives them weight, and the record Aina and Daniel assembled over 2 decades was sweeping and damning. Financials showed money for children's meals diverted into personal accounts. Medical files exposed systematic neglect and abuse. Employment records put kids as young as 8 to work in commercial kitchens without pay. The recording Laurel Benton played for the packed courtroom was 20 years old, but restoration tech, developed by Daniel's company, made every syllable crisp. Vivian's younger voice, just as frigid, spelled out a plan to use group home children as unpaid labor while billing the state for full care. "Those kids are worth more working than eating," she said with clinical cool. "Let them think that soup kitchen woman stole their money. It keeps them grateful and keeps them quiet. If any get too mouthy, we can always make them disappear somewhere else in the system. Who's going to miss a couple of throwaway kids?" What followed was a community uprising, conscience on its feet. Homeless families flooded city council chambers with signs bearing Eliza's face and testimonials about meals served beneath the bridge. Former group home residents, now adults, told stories that made hardened reporters cry. She fed us, they chanted, voices bouncing off marble and back at the officials whose blindness and graft had sheltered Vivian's abuse. She fed us when no one else would. She saw us when no one else cared. Faced with overwhelming proof of his administration's complicity in 20 years of systemic child abuse, the mayor called an emergency press conference and announced his immediate resignation. The deputy mayor, Vivian's husband, was arrested before he could follow suit. The city council voted unanimously to void every contract Blackwell Holdings had ever received, and the state attorney general announced a criminal investigation that would eventually reach into dozens of similar facilities across the region. But Daniel's testimony was the bomb that leveled Vivian's empire entirely. The killing blow was delivered with the precision of someone who'd been planning it for 20 years. His forensic accounting, backed up by teams of investigators and data analysts, proved that Blackwell Holdings had embezzled $2.8 million from school lunch programs over the past decade. Money meant to feed children was redirected to Vivian's personal accounts, vacation homes, and luxury cars. The numbers were staggering, but it was the human cost that truly broke hearts in that courtroom. Daniel Serrano spoke in a voice that remained steady despite the tears streaming down his face, describing how he and his sister had been forced to work 16-hour days in commercial kitchens, preparing thousands of meals for school districts while being fed nothing but thin gruel and stale bread. "We made food for other children while we starved," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of accumulated pain. "We prepared birthday cakes for school celebrations while we forgot what cake tasted like. We packaged lunches for field trips we would never take to places we would never see for childhoods we would never have." Aina's testimony was equally devastating, but delivered with the critical precision of someone who'd learned to weaponize her pain in service of justice. She detailed the systematic abuse that went beyond mere hunger, describing how children who complained or asked questions were punished with solitary confinement, how medical care was withheld as a form of control, and how education was replaced with labor that generated profit for Vivian's empire. "They didn't just steal our food," Aina said, her voice cutting through the silence of the packed courtroom like a blade through cloth. "They stole our childhoods, our health, our futures. They turned us into commodities, bought and sold and traded like livestock. And when we dared to dream of something better, when we dared to believe we deserved more than scraps and cruelty, they made sure we knew our place." The climax came on the third day of testimony when Vivian, finally realizing that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her like a house built on sand, lunged across the courtroom at Eliza in a final act of desperate rage. She moved like a woman possessed, her face twisted with 20 years of accumulated hatred for the person who'd shown kindness when Vivian had demanded only submission. But Eliza, weathered by 20 years of serving soup to desperate people, strengthened by decades of choosing love over fear, caught Vivian's wrist with hands that remained steady despite everything she'd endured. The courtroom held its breath as these two women faced each other across 20 years of pain and injustice. Predator and prey switching roles in a moment that felt like cosmic justice finally asserting itself. "You starved them," Eliza said, her voice calm as still water, carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You took children who had nothing and you gave them less than nothing. You turned their hunger into your profit and their pain into your pleasure. I saved you the trouble of having a conscience." The judge, a stern woman who'd seen too many cases of institutional abuse, but never one quite this systematic, sentenced Vivian to 15 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution to every child who'd been harmed by her operation. The amount was staggering, over $40 million when accounting for lost wages, medical costs, psychological damage, and punitive damages. But money, as important as it was, couldn't undo 20 years of trauma. What mattered more was the symbolic victory, the knowledge that someone had finally been held accountable for treating children like commodities instead of human beings. What mattered was the message sent to every other Vivian Blackwell operating. in the shadows that their time of reckoning would come. The mayor, faced with his own corruption charges and overwhelming evidence of his administration's complicity, held one final press conference before disappearing into federal protection and a plea deal that would keep him out of prison in exchange for his cooperation. At that conference, with shaking hands and a voice that cracked with something that might have been genuine remorse, he tore up every eviction notice his office had ever served against Eliza's various soup kitchens. Daniel, tears streaming down his face as he watched 20 years of planning finally come to fruition, handed Eliza a key. Not to the McLaren, though that was part of the package. Not to money, though there was plenty of that too. The key was to something far more valuable, something that represented the completion of a circle that had begun with a bowl of soup on a snowy December morning. The new humble bowl opened 6 months later in the heart of downtown, a gleaming facility that looked like a restaurant, but operated like a mission. The building had been Vivian's headquarters, the place where she'd planned her empire of exploitation. But now it hummed with the sound of industrial mixers preparing soup for anyone who needed it. The kitchen was state-of-the-art, capable of serving 500 meals a day, but it was designed with dignity in mind. The dining room looked like a real restaurant, with tablecloths and flowers and music playing softly in the background. There were no lines, no numbers, no degrading processes designed to make people feel ashamed of their hunger. There were just tables and chairs and servers who understood that food is love made visible. The gold plaque by the door read simply, "No one leaves hungry," but underneath, in smaller letters that most people missed unless they were looking for it, were the words that really mattered, in memory of every child who went to bed hungry, and in hope that no child ever will again. Even Vivian, working off her community service in the kitchen while serving the first year of her sentence under a work release program, learned something about the dignity of honest labor and the satisfaction of feeding others instead of feeding off them. She worked in silence, mostly, her designer clothes replaced by a simple apron, her manicured nails broken from honest work. At first, she did the work with resentful compliance, going through the motions without understanding the mission. But gradually something began to change. Maybe it was seeing the gratitude in people's eyes when they received a meal. Maybe it was finally understanding what it meant to give instead of take. Or maybe it was simply the way 20 years of accumulated guilt finally found a constructive outlet. One evening, as they were closing up the kitchen, Vivian approached Eliza with something that might have been an apology, struggling to escape from lips that had never learned how to form such words. "I don't know how to say sorry for 20 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eliza looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had caused so much pain, who had turned cruelty into a business model and suffering into profit. Then she pressed a ladle into Vivian's hand and said, "Plain as prayer. Begin with tomorrow's soup." During the shutdown of Cedar Ridge Group Home, Ana adopted a little girl. A child with cavernous eyes and broomstick arms who reminded everyone of two kids who'd wandered into a diner 2 decades earlier. The girl had bounced through the system for 3 years, shifted from house to house, failed by every safeguard meant to shield her. "Her name is Eliza," Ana announced at the grand opening. The child fused to her fingers like a lifeline as she absorbed the warmth and plenty of the new, humble bowl with eyes not yet ready to trust what they saw. And she's going to grow up knowing this world holds people who will feed her when she's hungry and hold her when she's afraid. No one there missed the symbolism. The circle had come around. Trauma turning into mending. Pain forged into purpose. The little girl would grow up where Vivian Blackwell's empire of exploitation had given way to Eliza Penrose's legacy of mercy, where the same rooms that once plotted profits from human suffering now offered free meals to anyone in need. McKenna 94, mind still keen as noon despite a bent spine and a careful shuffle, made it to the ceremony, leaning hard on a walker and turning down every chair. He had outlasted Hopper's Diner, outlasted 3 owners, and outlasted his own guess at how long a dishwasher can keep going on grit and sheer stubbornness. He inched up to Eliza mid-program, cataracts fogging but his gaze still bright, and rendered a verdict on 2 decades of struggle and grace. "Kid," he rasped, voice rough as sand dragged across concrete. "You fed the wolves, and they remembered. Funny what happens when you give instead of take." The loveliest moment arrived on a snowy December night. Exactly 20 years after the first bowl of soup that set all this in motion, Eliza was locking the kitchen when a hum rose from the dining room so clear and sweet it seemed to make the air itself quiver with joy. There sat Anna, now a thriving attorney and a mother, softly singing, "You Are My Sunshine," while her daughter colored at a table. The child pressed bright yellow across paper, sketching a bowl of soup whose steam curled into spirals that became musical notes. "My grandmother used to sing that at the first orphanage," Anna said when she noticed Eliza in the doorway. "Before hunger got so loud we forgot our songs. Before we learned music was a luxury we couldn't afford. You gave it back to us, the right to remember joy, the permission to hope for better things." Eliza's eyes filled with tears she'd damned for 20 years. Salt water tasting of vindication, sorrow, and thanks all at once. All those years of doubt. All those nights wondering if she'd chosen well. If a single bowl could matter in a world thick with cruelty and indifference. Here was her answer, humming in the warm light of a kitchen lit by hope. Not hunger. The old recipe box was gone, lost to that fire long ago. But Eliza had learned the best recipes aren't written anyway. They pass heart to heart, from one hungry soul to the next, in the plain miracle of seeing a need and deciding to meet it. They're not measured in cups and teaspoons, but in courage and compassion, seasoned with justice and served with the understanding that we're only temporary stewards of whatever abundance we're given. Feed one mouth, you save a body. Feed a spirit, you save a lineage. As I close this account, from the chair by the window where I've watched nearly a century turn, I can see the humble bowl. The lights burn late. The door stays open, steam lifting like prayers toward heaven. The building glows warm against December's dark, a beacon for anyone who needs proof that kindness still lives in a world that sometimes forgets how to care. Some nights, with snow falling and the world hushed except for wind and bare branches, a black McLaren eases to the curb. 2 figures step out. No longer the hollow-eyed children they were, but capable adults who remember where they came from and who held them through their worst hours. They roll up sleeves and serve whoever's hungry, faces mirroring the same gentleness Eliza showed them long ago. Daniel, now in his late 20s, moves through the line with the efficiency of someone who learned early just how precious food can be. He's expanded Nourish into a 12-city network, partnering with people who once lived on the street to run local hubs, creating jobs for those who understand hunger from the inside. His company doesn't merely deliver food. It delivers dignity, regard, and the radical belief that everyone deserves to eat well, no matter their ability to pay. Anna works with city and state leaders to reshape child welfare, using law and lived memory to write policy that puts children's well-being above institutional ease. She's helped pass measures for tougher oversight of group homes, stronger funding for nutrition, and sharper penalties for anyone who profits from abuse. Together, they built a foundation in Eliza's name, awarding grants to soup kitchens and pantries across the country. More than money, they offer what can't be tallied: hope. Hope that systems can bend, that justice can win, that seeds of kindness planted in dark soil can grow into something bright and transforming. The McLaren has become a story in itself. Daniel later had it sprayed from black to cheerful yellow, and Anna added free meals inside on the doors in letters no one can miss. It isn't just a car now. It's a moving ad for redemption, a rolling reminder that even the tools of the corrupt can be remade into instruments of healing. And sometimes, if the wind is right and the night is very still, you can hear something drift from that kitchen. Not only ladles clinking or broth bubbling, but something else, something that sounds a lot like hope, like mending, like the echo of a 9-year-old's voice humming, "You are my sunshine," while she colors bowls of soup and pictures a world without hungry children. The veterans from beneath the Morrison Street Bridge still gather. Most have housing now through programs Aina helped build, but they come for meals and because they remember when Eliza served them from a shopping cart with more heart than means. They come to honor a woman who knew that dignity counts. As much as calories, seeing a person's humanity matters as much as filling their stomach.
CT Miguel Sandoval, his prosthetic now state-of-the-art thanks to benefits. Priya Kapoor helped him secure works part-time at the Humble Bowl as a guard. Not because the place needs guarding, but because he wants to shield the woman who shielded him when hunger and pride were all he had left. Maeve Callahan, the Vietnam nurse, runs the Humble Bowl's medical clinic, tending basic health needs for anyone who walks through the door. She's seen too much suffering to turn anyone away, and she understands that hunger and illness are often partners in the dance of poverty. Her clinic operates on the same principle as Eliza's kitchen. No questions asked, no judgment passed, just help given to whoever needs it. The anniversary of their first bowl of soup has become an unofficial holiday in the neighborhood. A day when the community comes together to remember that individual acts of kindness can echo through decades. The celebration isn't grand or elaborate. It's just a shared meal where everyone sits at the same table, where the served become the servers, where former enemies break bread together in a ritual of reconciliation that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. Vivian, now 3 years into her sentence and genuinely transformed by the experience of serving others, wrote a letter that Eliza keeps framed on her office wall. It's not an eloquent document. Vivian was never much with words when they weren't being used as weapons, but it's sincere in a way that cuts through all the legal language in courtroom drama to touch something essential about human nature's capacity for change. I spent 20 years building an empire on other people's hunger. The letter reads in Vivian's careful handwriting. I convinced myself I was helping, that I was providing structure and discipline to children who needed guidance, but I was really just feeding my own hunger for power and control. You showed me the difference between taking and giving, between using people and serving them. I can't undo 20 years of damage, but I can try to spend the rest of my life balancing the scales. The letter goes on to detail Vivian's plans for when she's released, her intention to use her business skills to support organizations like the Humble Bowl, her commitment to making amends, not just through restitution, but through service. It's signed simply, Vivian Blackwell, as if she's finally learning to take responsibility for both parts of her identity instead of hiding behind titles and married names. So next time you pass a soup kitchen or see someone hungry on the street, or encounter a small act of kindness that seems insignificant in the grand scheme of things, remember Eliza Penrose and 2 orphan children who learned that love can be ladled from a bowl and served with crackers on the side. Listen close. You might just hear your name in the steam, calling you to remember that in a world full of Vivian Blackwells, we all have the choice to be Eliza Penrose instead. The choice to see hunger and fill it, to see loneliness and warm it, to see despair and offer it a seat at the table where everyone is welcome. And no one leaves empty. Because that's the thing about soup kitchens. You see, they're not really about the soup at all. They're about the kitchen part, the place where strangers become family, where a broken get mended one meal at a time, and where ordinary people discover they have the power to change the world one bowl at a time. That torn apron Eliza wore during those bridge years now hangs framed in the new Humble Bowl kitchen. A reminder that sometimes the most important uniform is the one stained with service to others. Every morning when the staff arrives to begin preparing the day's meals, they touch their frame for luck, carrying forward the legacy of a woman who proved that the smallest acts of kindness can echo through decades, can transform lives, can literally move mountains of indifference and create valleys of compassion where none existed before. The recipe for that first bowl of soup, the one that started this whole chain of events, has been recreated and perfected by the Humble Bowls chef, Asher Quinn, a former Food Network star who gave up his television career to serve meals to people who couldn't pay for them. It's called Eliza's Special, and it's made with ingredients that can't be measured: a cup of compassion, a tablespoon of hope, a generous portion of human dignity, and love enough to feed anyone who's hungry. Every bowl served carries that same energy, that same intention, that same refusal to accept that anyone should go hungry in a world of abundance. The steam that rises from those bowls carries more than just the aroma of vegetables and broth. It carries the promise that someone cares, that someone sees you, that someone believes you deserve to be fed regardless of your circumstances or your ability to reciprocate. The Humble Bowl now has 7 locations across 3 states, each one staffed partially by people who were once served there. People who understand hunger from the inside and refuse to let others experience what they experienced. The model has been replicated by other organizations, creating a network of compassion that stretches across the country like a web of hope. But it all started with one woman who saw 2 hungry children and decided that rules mattered less than hunger, that profit mattered less than people, that her own comfort mattered less than someone else's desperate need. It started with a choice that seemed small at the time, but rippled outward like circles on a pond, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined. And as I sit here in my chair, watching the snowfall outside my window on another December evening, I can see those circles still rippling outward. I can see the Humble Bowl's warm lights cutting through the darkness, promising warmth and sustenance to anyone who needs it. I can see the yellow McLaren parked outside, its cheerful color a deliberate rejection of the darkness it once represented. Most importantly, I can see hope. Hope that systems can change, that justice can prevail, that individual acts of kindness matter in ways we may never fully understand. Hope that in a world that sometimes seems designed to crush the vulnerable, there will always be people like Eliza Penrose who choose compassion over convenience, service over self-interest, love over fear. The steam still rises from that kitchen every night, carrying with it the prayers of the fed and the hopes of the hungry. And somewhere in that steam, if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you can hear the voice of every soul who was touched by kindness when they needed it most. You can hear them saying thank you. You can hear them saying they remember. You can hear them promising to pass it on. And in a world that too often forgets the power of simple human decency, that promise echoes louder than any symphony, more beautiful than any song, as enduring as the love that first filled a bowl with soup and changed the world one spoonful at a time. Winter returns softly now. From my chair by the window, I watch steam rise from the Humble Bowl like it always does, steady, certain, a small lighthouse against the long night. The yellow McLaren sits at the curb with its promise on the doors, but most folks don't notice the paint anymore. They see the open door. They see the welcome dot inside. The rhythm is familiar. Ladles tap, trays slide. A bell rings when a fresh pot is ready. CT checks coats at the door and tells jokes only he finds funny. Maeve moves between tables with a nurse's gentleness and a general's eye. Some nights Vivian is on onion duty, eyes watering, hands sure. She doesn't speak much. She doesn't have to. There's a kind of apology only sweat can make. Daniel stands back more these days, letting new hands learn the weight of a full pot. Hold it close, he says, so it doesn't slosh. Aina reviews tomorrow's case notes at a corner table, then tucks her folder away and ties on an apron. The work calls louder than the paperwork ever did. Little Eliza no longer so little keeps a crayon drawing taped above the pass. A bowl, spirals of steam turning into music notes. Some nights she hums "You Are My Sunshine" while stacking cups, the way her mother once did, a hymn for anyone who needs one. Walt shuffles in around closing, as he always has, and claims the second stool from the end. He doesn't wash dishes anymore. but the staff still leaves one plate for him to wipe. The way a family sets a place for someone who taught them how to eat together. If you listen, you'll hear it, the quiet proof. Not speeches, not headlines. Just the scrape of chair legs making room. Just the soft yes of a door that doesn't lock. Just a pot refilled before it's empty. We like to say the first bowl changed everything. Maybe that's true. Or maybe everything changed because someone kept the ladle moving. If you're wondering what to do next, the answer is older than hunger and newer than morning. Start with tomorrow's soup.